All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us and welcome. My name is Babak Ashrafi. This is a forum in the history of science at the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. And today's topic is psychedelics in America. And I'm delighted to have with us two wonderful people to talk about this topic, Benjamin Breen and Jonathan Moreno. Benjamin Breen is associate professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz. He is, as I'm sure our audience knows, author of Tripping on Utopia, Margaret, Meade, The Cold War, and the Troubled Birth of Psychedelic Science. You have surely seen the reviews in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Science, and elsewhere. His first book was called The Age of Intoxication, Origins of the Global Drug Trade. It came out in 2019. It won the Welch Medal for the best award in the history of medicine for the best book. He won the Welch Medal for the best book in the history of medicine from the American Association of History of Medicine. And he did some of that work when he was a consortium research fellow. He has written widely beyond academic venues in the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Chronicle of Higher Education, as well as new online media and many other places. Thank you for joining us, Ben.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate having a chance to talk again in this venue because the consortium and you personally, Babak, were like a key moment in my graduate studies. It was like one of the early grants that I got that let me write my dissertation, which became my first book, and it was very important to me in my life. So thank you for having the chance to talk here, and thank you to everyone who's watching online. I guess what I'll start with is just basically why I wrote this book, because I trained as an early modern historian of science and medicine in sort of a transnational or transimperial context. I did research in Portugal, and my first book is largely focused on apothecaries and drugs. You know, the drugs is a topic that runs through my research, but very different time period, 18th, 17th centuries. And it was looking at, a whole different category of drugs for the most part, like nutmeg or tobacco or chocolate. But, and I'll get to this in a second, I did actually do some research into the early modern histories of ayahuasca and peyote and other drugs that later came to be known as psychedelics. And that was one of the things that kind of was actually left over from my very earliest archival research. For instance, the work that the consortium funded in Princeton area and Philadelphia area archives when I was in grad school, that ended up inspiring my interest in my second book. And one of the things I loved about researching Tripping on Utopia was that a lot of the people involved in the story were still alive when I began researching the book. That has actually since changed. I feel like there was a lot of the people were in their early 90s and late 80s when I was starting this research and, just before COVID. And it's now sort of fading into a generation that's passing away. People in their late 90s are now the people that I'm in touch with or aware of who have firsthand experience of this kind of pre-1960s moment in psychedelic history. But I had a great time and a really interesting time speaking to the children of a lot of people, and actually in some cases going to private archives, which was a new experience for me. So this is a photo I took in the archives of Oscar Janiger, who's a really early and important psychedelic therapist in the Los Angeles area. I'll talk more about his role in a little bit. But one of the things I like to do when I talk about the book is just in telling the story of why the book came to be and what the argument is, I also like to focus on the archives I looked at and the new the new research that I did to kind of tell a different and I think an alternative story of the history of psychedelics, which is also in a way, I hope, an interesting look at the history of the Cold War, the history of science and medicine in general in the period between roughly the 1920s and the 1960s and 70s. And also, like, I think of it as sort of a key moment in the development of how we as a society think about technology, because psychedelics, as I'll speak about, were very much framed in an idealistic fashion as sort of new technological subject matter that can be mobilized by industrial societies to prevent world wars, to heal psychic trauma, or as weapons. And so what I'm interested in is not the longue durée history of psychedelics in this book, although that's a topic I've written about and find interesting, but really how did psychedelics become mobilized as scientific and medical objects, as tools in the world, which can be applied and used in various ways. And that's a really different thing than the stuff I wrote about in my first book, where psychedelics, if they're mentioned, almost always show up as like a Spanish or Portuguese missionary saying there's this demonic substance that is used in the jungle. It's just like usually almost always, pretty much always I can say it's like a few sentences where it's just like the peoples of this land use a substance called ayahuasca, like ayahuasca, which contains DMT. But they would just say something like it is a satanic vine which causes intoxication and makes people see illusions, and that's it. It's usually not really mentioned. And in medical contexts, through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, psychedelics, if they do appear in written works, usually as a curiosity. So really, one of the key points of the book is that clearly it was the 20th century when psychedelic medicine and psychedelic science became a thing, you know, entered into um, the sort of realm of scientific possibility. It's something that professional scientists could then use themselves and write about, publish research on. But it wasn't a story of the second half of the 20th century, which is what I thought when I entered into this research. It's actually the first half of the 20th century, and it's strongly shaped both by the two world wars and by the group of people on the cover here, who are loosely, I think of them as a circle of people brought together by the Josiah Macy Jr. conferences. Macy Foundation is still in existence as a medical nonprofit that funds medical research. Um, but in the 30s and 40s, really in the 40s, it became this like key social and intellectual circle, largely centered on Margaret Meade, but also including people like Henry Beecher, Seymour Keedy or Keddy, Roy Grinker, who's sitting next to me there. I'll talk about them in a second. You may have heard of it as one of the foundation points of AI research, actually. So cybernetics emerged out of the Macy Foundation conferences. Cybernetics, I would say, is kind of the predecessor to the field of computer science and machine learning. So there's something interesting going on with that connection. Perhaps we can talk about it in the Q&A. But in terms of the connections between this world of sort of proto-psychedelic researchers in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and the present, one of the key things that I think is important to keep in mind as we sort of see or draw connections between this kind of earlier first wave of psychedelic science and the present wave is this tension between those who want to introduce psychedelics into both medical practice and into a larger cultural context in a sudden way, roll them out as a prescription drug treatment for all kinds of ailments, make them a miracle drug, basically. Or in the non-medical context, legalize psychedelics, have dispensaries selling it, see what happens. That's the kind of sudden or destabilizing approach. And then the alternative approach is what Sidney Cohen, one of the key early psychedelic researchers on the West Coast, called the anthropological approach. And I think he specifically had in mind Margaret Meade here because he was very influenced by her work, which is really an approach which is more rooted in historical context. It's trying to understand the past cultures or non-Western cultures of psychedelic use, which strikingly are almost always marked by very stringent limitations on who can use a psychedelic substance. It's pretty much unheard of in non-Western cultures for psychedelics to be used in this broad-based way where anyone has access to them. And also, it's more incremental. It's a slow, decades or even centuries-long process of adaptation. And so, to me, that's been kind of one of the main tensions that I observed in reading through the archives of these early scientists and doctors interested in psychedelics. And I think it's still one today. It's a strong tension present in the field today. Another is that not only does history repeat itself in the time frame of the decades, so we can point to the 1950s as an era of, the first wave of psychedelic hype. Acid Hype is a book by Stephen Siff on this era when, Time and Life magazines were actually writing very positive articles about LSD. And then there was a sort of hangover in the 60s when all of the repercussions of that sort of fell on the field, and suddenly psychedelics were blamed for all kinds of things that previously they had been portrayed as very benign and even hugely beneficial substances. Then they became blamed for wave of suicides, of cultural destabilization, Charlie Manson, et cetera. I kind of feel like we're seeing that now to a certain extent. I mean, literally in the news right now, I was just reading that the shooter of the healthcare United Healthcare CEO was posting on social media about psychedelics, and so I wonder actually if that's going to show up in the news again right now. But certainly in the past year or two, I think we've seen a bit of a swing away from the hype and optimism of years previous. But on a deeper historical time frame, we actually see, I think, really interestingly, that there's kind of a centuries long trend of medical appreciation or attempts at understanding psychedelics' medical role, which then gets subverted or at least made a lot more complicated by societal fears about who is using psychedelics. So uh, one really striking fact about peyote, which contains mescaline, um, is that it actually was banned by the Spanish Inquisition, partly apparently because it was seen being used in taverns by soldiers. So there's something interesting there about medical versus recreational and how that kind of plays out on deeper time frames as a source of, anxiety or apprehension among people in a position to make laws. Um, I don't have time to show the video for this talk, but I warmly encourage anyone who's interested in this after this talk to look up this YouTube video. Um, and it's available on YouTube. If you search like housewife on LSD 1950s on YouTube, you will find it. I find this video incredibly striking and interesting. And really, it was one of the things that gave me a feeling like I was getting a purchase on the topic or starting to form an interesting perspective on it. Uh, what's striking about this video is that it shows a woman in the late 1950s being administered LSD by Sidney Cohen, the guy I mentioned earlier, as a test subject on TV. And he asks her if she's normal, and she says, "I think so. At least I hope so." Um, and she kind of comes off very much as you would expect a 1950s woman to come off in this sort of very gendered context of a male scientist wearing a lab coat, questioning her on TV. She acts very submissive, and she seems very nervous. When LSD kicks in, the power dynamic completely flips, and she actually says to Sidney Cohen, "I feel sorry for you." And it's like this really striking inversion of what I thought of as the gender dynamics and societal dynamics of 1950s America. To my mind, it's really one of the keys to understanding what's going on with psychedelics in this period. That above all, this was broadcast on TV. This was not something hidden away. People were just watching this on television in 1957. It was on CBS. Um, and another thing I find striking about it is that we don't know who this woman is. And there's many other examples like her. There's several documentaries that were on TV with this kind of thing happening, several newspaper articles and magazine articles along the same lines. And I think this is kind of the jumping off point for my own interest in the topic, was asking these questions of why did psychedelics become so socially acceptable for a period of time in the 50s? Why were they medicalized and made into scientific tools in this period? Um, what was going on with that kind of culture of science that made that possible? And then why did it change so suddenly? And to a surprising extent, the answers to those questions actually converged on Margaret Meade and her third husband, Gregory Bateson, who's the guy at left here. I don't have time to get into her backstory with Rayo Fortune, her second husband at right. Suffice to say, it's a very interesting story. There's actually a famous novel called Euphoria about their love triangle in the jungles of New Guinea in the early 1930s. By the point that this photo is taken, Margaret Meade was already a globally famous celebrity scientist because Coming of Age in New Guinea had come out. It was a bestseller. She was in all the newspapers. Gregory Bateson was struggling to finish his master's degree. So again, speaking of the power dynamic, she was very much the dominant sort of intellectual and I would say relation in terms of the whole relationship, the dominant figure in that marriage, which was also a very important scientific partnership. But what ends up happening around this time, this is 1933, but a little bit before this, and especially afterward in World War II, is that Margaret Meade shifts from being an anthropologist, fully a cultural anthropologist, to being someone a little bit more interdisciplinary and actually not even fully a scientist at all, but more of a public figure, a kind of a spokesperson for science and how it should be used in the world. self-appointed. She sort of saw that as her role. And one of the interesting things that I started finding as I looked into Bateson's archives, which are here at UCSC, and then at Margaret Meade's archives at the Library of Congress, which are extraordinary and huge, is that she had a very, very strong interest in altered states of consciousness, which ran all the way through her research, from her teenage years up to her research that made her famous. And in particular, she went to the Omaha tribal lands in Nebraska and lived with the Omaha people in the summer of 1930 and observed peyote ceremonies, and actually took copious notes on them and wrote about them. And so by the time this photo was taken, Margaret Meade, I would argue, was already a psychedelic researcher in the making. Now, I will note that the term psychedelic did not yet exist, but she was interested in peyote, and in particular in the ways that altered states of consciousness induced by peyote connected to changes related to technological modernity and modern science, and the ways it was operating outside of a medical framework, but still not in a what we might call a traditional or context. Peyote, in her mind, was actually a tool of modernization being used by the Omaha to adapt to modern life, not a holdover from a pre-modern world. That's actually the key thing that Margaret Meade brings to the story in my mind, that I think injects this new way of thinking about psychedelics into this larger social circle. As I'll talk about in a second, she also was very involved in LSD research in the mid-1950s. And Bateson, although I won't have time to talk about it at length, was a key mentor to the people who actually developed psychedelic therapy as a field in the Bay Area and Palo Alto in the 1950s. So this photo shows the fifth Macy Conference on Problems of Consciousness, which to my mind is the most important one for kind of understanding, like basically who are the key figures involved in forming psychedelic therapy as a field? Where does it come from? And the Macy Foundation actually sponsors the very first ever international conference on LSD therapy in 1959. But that's because of Margaret Meade and Harold Abramson, who are pictured in this photo. And this is a really interesting alternative photo that I found from speaking to the children of one of the people in it. This guy at upper left, Conan Kornetsky, actually had this photo hanging on his wall throughout his life. It seems to be the unconscious version of the officially published conscious photo from the Problems of Consciousness conference. And I kind of love this. So I put it on the cover of my book because to me it's like a great guide to who's involved and also the kind of strangeness at the heart of it. So some of the people we see here are, just jumping back to the actual people, Mary Brazier is one of the key founders of the field of neuroscience. So very important in sort of the very early interfaces between computational measurements and methods and understandings of the brain. Harold Abramson is probably the most important, I would say, the most important figure in the MKUltra project. He was a allergist and psychiatrist in his public life, but privately he was a longtime consultant, first for the Pentagon in World War II, and then after the CIA's founding, for the CIA for a period of 2 decades at least. We also have Seymour Ketty, who is like key institutional figure in funding science in this period, one of the sort of early leading figures of the National Institutes for Mental Health. I don't think I've pictured him, but this is Harry Beecher up here, anesthesiologist at Harvard Medical School, also a psychedelic researcher and drug researcher in general. It's very important. Roy Grinker is the founder of narcosynthesis, which I think is one of the key predecessor concepts and practices that leads directly into the formation of psychedelic therapy as a field. So just to briefly talk about narcosynthesis, I think this is one of the key things to understand, is that even before psychedelics were being thought of in terms of the specific constellation of drugs that we can now call psychedelic: LSD, mescaline, psilocybin, later ketamine. There was a different group of drugs that were being used in a very, very similar way, almost the same way, and actually by the same people. And this is like an important sociological point of my book, that because the people involved in early psychedelic research lived through World War II and in many cases participated actively in various psychological research initiatives and projects of World War II, they were kind of carrying that forward into the post-war period, more or less, in some cases, unchanged. So narcosynthesis today, not really widely known. In the mid 40s, early 40s, very widely publicized and actually widely experienced by thousands of people, mostly in the context of the battlefield in the Tunisian campaign was the origin of it, but in Europe and then later in the Pacific theater of World War II, there were thousands, if not tens of thousands, of soldiers who were treated using various combinations of drugs, usually sodium amytal, which is famous as a truth drug, but was basically used broadly as a kind of a drug that would induce a sort of somnolent state or some sort of twilight state between consciousness and unconsciousness, which was theorized to allow a person to surface or clear, which is a term which was used by narcosynthesis researchers, their traumatic memories. And so basically, it was in fact directly portrayed as a sped up version of Freudian psychoanalysis. Roy Grinker, the guy I was showing earlier here, was actually very Freudian in his outlook and was in fact a student, or not a student, a patient of Freud's. He tracked down Freud and as I think he was 20 years old or something, he was in college. He went to Freud and asked to be a patient and was admitted. And so he's like a huge kind of longtime proponent of psychoanalysis who developed this method, which is almost portrayed as like a new technological version of it. Technological because it's using these newly discovered drugs on the battlefield. They claim, the work of months of psychoanalysis and talk therapy in a period of a few hours or days by speeding up the release of these traumatic memories through the use of drugs. So you'll note that not only is the model of psychedelic therapy kind of forming here, for instance, the claim that psychedelics can cure or treat PTSD is traceable back to this moment, but also the kind of utopian, you might say, claims being made about it, or at least highly optimistic claims being made. Now, why is that? And I really circled around this question a lot because these were serious people and they were not really commercially motivated. You know, they weren't trying to make money from this. I genuinely think that the people who were proponents of narcosynthesis and then later psychedelic therapy who claimed that it was this revolutionary treatment in the 40s and 50s were motivated by actual idealism. They were not cynical. They were not trying to make money from it. They really were thinking of this as something which would change the world for the better. And the more I kind of looked into their backstories and the context for the history of medicine, the more I came to think that they kind of had a point in the sense that the life that they observed in psychiatric institutions and clinics in the 30s and 40s was absolutely horrifying by modern standards, in large part because of the high use of lobotomies. So a lot of the people who were being treated by psychedelic therapists, and before that by people investigating novel drug treatments for various mental disorders in the 40s, would have been lobotomized in previous years. And so they were seeing what they were doing as saving these patients and these people from a pretty horrifying fate of just having their frontal cortex completely severed or, you know, severely damaged in a way that is just like, you know, appalling to think about today. Even those who were not being subjected to lobotomies were being subjected to things like insulin shock therapy, which again was apparently quite horrifying to witness. I've in the archive, I found a lot of very troubled reports by psychiatrists and others about witnessing the results of insulin shock therapy and being horrified by it, including Gregory Bateson's archive. He has a statement about that. So narcosynthesis and then psychedelic therapy was being framed as this sort of savior to patients who would previously have been subjected to lobotomy, which it's worth noting was widely in use and even hugely praised. You know, it's won the Nobel Prize in 1949 for medicine. And that's 49. That's not 1919 or 1929. It's exactly the period when psychedelic therapy is forming. 1949 is also the first time that LSD is being tested in early trials in North America. So it's exactly the same time period. And I think it's an important backstory for this. Likewise, this chart I think is really important to keep in mind when thinking about what happened to psychedelics in the 20th century. Deinstitutionalization, the closure of these Victorian era or, you know, kind of early 20th century mental clinics and psychiatric institutions, which had very bad conditions in large part, but which were not really replaced by anything except prisons. And so there was this enormous incentive, as you can see in the 50s in particular, is the moment of maximum change here. It's when the graph really has this inflection point. In the 50s in particular, there was a perception that something was needed, something had to be done to address this influx of people who formerly had been institutionalized. And that something was initially narcosynthesis or various other drug treatments. Um, there's a little byway in my book about L. Ron Hubbard because for a period of time in the early 50s, Dianetics was being portrayed as the thing that would heal mental illness and the trauma of the post-war generation. I think in large part that perception that something is needed, something outside of traditional psychiatric and medical frameworks, really fueled the early success of Dianetics very early, 1950, 1951, which later became Scientology. And as a weird alternate history, I mean, L. Ron Hubbard initially was a proponent of narcosynthesis. He just had his own drug regimen. He himself apparently, it would appear, was a narcosynthesis patient because he claimed to have combat neurosis, what we would call PTSD. And he kind of invented his own drug treatment plan involving amphetamine usage and, you know, the things that later became Scientology, like an e-meter and so forth. But he's kind of an early, you know, alternative figure that, and also an early example of the kind of cult of personality that came later to form around psychedelic proponents like Timothy Leary. Um, by the mid 50s, LSD is really coming to the fore as the psychedelic of choice for the people making these utopian claims that, you know, there's a new thing which can not only explain the nature of consciousness, it also potentially can be something which will heal the age of anxiety, which is this term that's beginning to circulate at this time, largely governed by the Korean War, I would say, the perception that World War III is right around the corner. This is the era of the Manchurian Candidate, the idea that brainwashing is like a widespread weapon being mobilized on both sides of the Cold War. Um, and it's also a period, I would say, of maximum techno-utopianism. You know, this is the era just before Sputnik. This is the period when science fiction becomes mainstreamed in American culture. If you want to trace back the origins of like, why are Marvel movies so popular? Why are we always talking about science fiction in our culture? It really goes back to the 1950s. And it also is the period when science becomes elevated as this secular expression of the highest ideals of society. You know, Albert Einstein becomes this sort of like revered cult figure in the 50s. That's the formation of, I would say, a modern scientific self to a large extent. And Margaret Meade is actually one of the key people who is an exemplar of that. She's one of the most famous scientists in the world by the mid 1950s. Certainly the most famous female scientist, I would say, living. I was really struck by how much Margaret Meade really seemed to have no personal stake in any of the current implementations of psychedelics. She wasn't, even though she was actually quite interested in narcosynthesis and was a proponent of it, she wasn't really seeing LSD as a cure for PTSD. At the time, it was being investigated as a cure for alcoholism, and Gregory Bateson was interested in that, but she wasn't really. She said things like, you know, talked to an informant, Ralph Bloom, a friend of her daughter, Catherine Bateson, um, told he had been working on Russian films, extraordinary speed of communication, he claimed due to LSD. I still don't quite understand what that means.
Mm.
um, got interested in a possibility of its being a speed shortcut. You know, that's kind of cryptic, right? And it's not really the way it's portrayed today at all. And then again, here is her own reason for taking LSD or wanting to. It's unclear if she ever did. The memo breaks off before she uses it, but it describes her plans to do so. Coming to the conclusion that I would try the drug, especially after reading Abramson's third paper, A Case of Removing Fear of Homosexuality, in one therapeutic 4-hour session. So again, it's the narcosynthesis model that this is like a sped up, ultra fast, high tech version of talk therapy, but it's specifically for removing fear of homosexuality. And it's a striking fact that if you go to Harold Abramson's actually published article, he actually describes LSD as a cure for homosexuality, specifically a woman who was one of his patients who expressed romantic interest in other women. He wasn't framing it as removing fear of that. He was just framing it as removing that desire. So that's Margaret Meade injecting her own theory, I think, into that story, perhaps based on private conversations or just her own observation. Now, what's interesting about her to me in this context is that Margaret Meade was an extremely, extremely prestigious scientist in the 50s. She was not yet an object of controversy or scorn, as she later became in the 80s. She was really important in the scientific hierarchy. She knew everyone. And she was actually performing psychological assessments of people on LSD as part of this program, which ultimately was CIA funded, although she was not aware of that. She thought of it as a Macy Foundation project. Um, and I actually spoke to one of the people who she performed a TAT type interrogation on, as she puts it in this note. Um, and she actually told me that uh, Meade was actually asking her about ESP, like whether under the influence of LSD she could do card guessing games and guess, like basically men who stare at goats kind of stuff. When you're on LSD, can you have some level of psychic powers, some ability to prognosticate or to know what's behind a closed door or in a black box, which I found quite interesting. And again, it shows her kind of casting about, trying to find what these things are actually doing to consciousness. The other main thing that I find fascinating about Meade, and I think this shapes a lot of the thinking about psychedelics that did not win. This is sort of the narrative for psychedelics in society that failed to have purchase culturally and was replaced by what I would call the Timothy Leary model of a charismatic founding figure and a mixture of non-Western mysticism with claims to Western style scientific efficacy, which is, I think, kind of like what we see today with Lycos. She says new possibility for LSD away from mysticism and escape, which I'm still totally struck by and I think is fascinating, that she sees it as something which would lead society toward a more, I would argue, a more secular or technological future, which is not defined by spirituality. And that's strongly shaped. I don't have time to get into it, but just before Meade takes this great interest in LSD, she had been living on an island off the coast of New Guinea, where what came to be called a cargo cult had taken hold. This new religious movement based on a kind of response to the intervention of World War II, the intervention of this massive two technological empires, the Japanese and the United States, um, you know, coming into conflict on this island, and suddenly kind of bringing very, very rapidly all the bad things and some of the good things about modern life of the 1950s into a society that had not been exposed to that. And Margaret Meade is actually literally directly linking the research she was doing on that island to what she's seeing in Manhattan in these therapist offices in the 1950s um, in the context of psychedelic therapy. So that's just like one of the most interesting things about the story to me. And then on a human level, she appears to decide not to intervene further in the field, in part because of her own fears of being exposed in both her bisexual relationship with a woman, Rhoda Matro, who became her lifelong partner from that point onwards. Um, they had already been partners, but they began living together in that same a few months after she wrote that memo. But also more generally, she's being investigated by the FBI in the mid 1950s, and it's the McCarthy era, and it's a very paranoid period. And she begins reading these articles about LSD potentially is maybe a truth drug or something that lays bare your darkest secrets. I think she kind of got spooked by the collision of these utopian goals with the Cold War. And in large part, that's kind of the story that plays out later in the 50s and 60s. I don't have time to talk about it here. I'm going to wrap up now, but Claire Booth Luce, very much integrated into the national security framework of the period and just politics. She's the person who introduced Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon at a cocktail party, um, Republican member of Congress, huge proponent of LSD. Later in the 60s, kind of pulls back on her public advocacy for it, but to me is really emblematic of this first era and the sort of strange bedfellows that it created. Cary Grant, this is from Claire Booth Lewis's archive at the Library of Congress. She writes another LSD book, and it's Cary Grant is talking up his own interest in psychedelic therapy and publicizing a book about LSD. And this is his trip report, which I found in that little box with the black cat on it that began this talk, where he's his 72nd LSD trip, where again he frames psychedelics in very technological terms, comparing himself to John Glenn going into space, which apparently happened the same day he was tripping on that day. So I'm going to wrap up here. Uh, to me, one of the main lessons, and also I have a lot of material on John C. Lilly if we want to talk about that, but we don't have time. But if I just have to talk about like the future of psychedelics or how I think this research bears upon it, one thing that I think is really important to take away is how much there's something about psychedelics as cultural objects of concern and medical, medical cures, would-be cures, that seems to attract personality cults and strong personalities that sort of try to shape the dominant cultural discourse about it. And I kind of see that happening now. Robert F. Kennedy, there's like this kind of psychedelic tinge to that whole sort of, to my mind, kind of horrifying social movement that's been happening in the world of medicine recently. MAPS kind of has elements of that. And I kind of feel like later in the 2020s, we'll be seeing more of this, that there's sort of something about mass media and semi-utopian or fully utopian claims and psychedelics that is like a very strong historical current running through the past decades that I suspect will reappear again and is reappearing again now.
I'm delighted that Jonathan Moreno is joining us as our second panelist. He is David and Lynn Silfen, sorry. He is David and Lynn Silfen University Professor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, where he works on the history and philosophy of bioethics, biology, and medicine. This is actually Jonathan's second appearance in a consortium forum. He did a forum in 2012 on science and the election, right after the election. Unfortunately, we weren't doing podcasts or recording back then. Jonathan has been an advisor to US presidents and on at least 3 presidential commissions. And he's advised as well the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the UNESCO International Bioethics Committee. He is a prolific author of papers, articles, reviews, op-eds, and books. His latest book, called Absolutely Essential: Bioethics and the Rules-Based International Order, will be out from MIT Press in the new year.
Well, I could first of all give an advertisement for Ben's book, which is fantastic. To me, it was a page turner. Maybe Babak, I could explain my autobiographical connection to the book. But to do that, I need to explain that my father was a well-known psychiatrist and social scientist, J.L. Moreno, who was 63 when I was born, and that dating is more than not bragging about his prolific nature, but also important for the dating of our conversation, because Margaret Meade was a close associate and supporter of my father's work for many years, beginning at least in 1938, when my father established a journal called Sociometry that he, in the mid-1950s, gave to the American Sociological Association. My father was famous for 2 things: psychodrama, which was role-playing in groups, in group therapy. In fact, he seems to have been the first person who used the term group therapy in print. And sociometry, which is we today call social network analysis. Meade was quite interested particularly in the social network analysis part of his work, was a big supporter. And in 1963, when I was 11 years old, I sat next to Professor Meade at a dinner. The occasion was a banquet for the annual meetings of my father's psychodrama society in the Roosevelt Hotel, about a block from Grand Central Terminal. I'm guessing that I'm probably one of the older people online for this conversation. So the academics and the social scientists, the physicians, may not know that every organization had a dinner, a big banquet, at their annual meeting, and my father's organization was no exception. There were a few dozen tables of people in formal dress, as people would have been dressed in the 50s and 60s. And then there was a long table at the head of the hall, where you could watch the officers and guests, VIPs of the organization, having their dinner. And then there was a speaker. So I was 11 years old, the only kid in the room, and I'm sitting next to a nice older lady. She's on my right. I can still see her very well in my mind. And somehow we start drawing animals together. I think my memoir, if I have one, if I'm narcissistic enough to write one, would be Drawing Animals with Margaret Meade. And so we proceeded to draw animals for a few minutes before her talk. Then she got up, and over to my left, I could see her at the lectern. I can still envision this nice lady at the lectern. To me, she was just another of the older folks that were associates and friends of my parents. That was 1963. I will say maybe a couple of things about where we stand with psychedelics now, because it was a question that Babak posed to me that I could perhaps talk about, because I'm not only interested in the history of psychedelics, but also in what's going on these days, and following it pretty closely. And you know, we went through a period of what you might call prohibition from the early 1970s through the early 2000s. And it was in the early 1970s when the Nixon administration engaged in its war on drugs, and it was pretty much impossible to get access to LSD 25, as it was still called, um, through the early 2000s when there was a renewed enthusiasm among a few people for particularly MDMA, a form of methamphetamine, and psilocybin as potentials for psychotherapy. I will just say that psychedelics is particularly in the news not only because of the so-called CEO shooter, but also because a few months ago, the National Institutes of, I'm sorry, the FDA declined to endorse a clinical trial of MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is a clinical trial that was mounted coming by a company called Lycos, which came out of an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And Lycos had reported on the results of its phase 3 trial. The data were thought to be very promising. Um, People who don't work in mental health may not know that around a third of people who are diagnosed with PTSD, in particular veterans, don't respond to psychotherapy and the standard sort of antipsychotics, antidepressants. So, as Ben was saying, you know, in a way, we're back where we were in the 50s, where people were looking for something new, something different, because the sense continues to be that standard uh, pharmaceutical therapy and standard talk therapies aren't doing what they need to do for people who are suffering with diseases like PTSD and chronic depression and anxiety, cancer related or death anxiety. So this was a very exciting moment a few months ago when the clinical trial was presented to the FDA, and it was with great disappointment, I would do an understatement, that people in psychedelic therapy field um, got the news that the advisory committee to the FDA had voted against approval. Uh, and one of the reasons that they were against approval, and there was, I think, only one person who voted for approval, um, was that there is psychotherapy involved in the administration of MDMA, and psychotherapy is a problem for the FDA because the FDA does not get involved in approving the practice of medicine or the practice of psychotherapy, and yet a level of commitment to the process it seems to be required in order for MDMA and other so-called psychedelics to perhaps be effective in the therapeutic setting. So there were also other problems shadowing the study. There are allegations of sexual abuse as part of that were part of the administration of the drug, and so in the final analysis, this company Lycos was the first out there, and as often happens with a company that's first out there with a product, they got the first criticism. So they have been challenged, and they say they will come back with more data in a phase 3 trial. The problem, and I wrote this to Babak, you know, what's the through line here from the period that Ben's talking about working on through the present day? The through line is we don't know what the hell these drugs really are. These compounds really are. What do they do? We don't really understand them. And part we don't understand them because we don't understand the nature of consciousness to begin with. Here we are waiting for the artificial general intelligence, right? That will be self-aware. Some people think we're already there. but we don't know what a consciousness is. We don't know what we'll be looking for. And so when you start talking about expanding consciousness, modifying consciousness, it's very difficult for our regulatory mechanisms to know how to understand that. And again, back to the era that Ben's talking about, the DEA, right, and the FDA itself didn't in the early '60s might have approved LSD for therapy, but they weren't persuaded by the evidence, and the clinical trials weren't nearly as good even as the phase 3 trial that Lykos presented to the FDA a few months ago.
Studying the history of psychedelics is also a way into studying consciousness, like problems of consciousness. What is consciousness? What happened? What are the legal ramifications of partial loss of consciousness? Um, you know, that's a bioethics question, but it's also just like a philosophical one. Can someone who's been subjected to a lobotomy consent to be a test subject for psychedelics? Can someone who's under duress in any fashion consent? Or just more broadly, are you the same person when you're taking a psychedelic, when you're under a psychedelic state? Is consciousness continuous in that way? These are really big questions, but also what I found so interesting about them is they played out in these very specific ways in individual people's lives. So I was kind of able to be an historian about it rather than a philosopher and see how these debates actually became like, you know, instantiated in the historical record and then became important for understanding the course of history. So there's the legalization aspect of psychedelics. There's also the Cold War part, you know, the weaponization of psychedelics, which maybe will come up in Q&A, but actually was surprisingly important in the kind of planning of, you know, covert operations and just military operations in general in the 50s and 60s. The idea that there was a new psychochemical warfare shows up everywhere in this period and is taken very seriously.
Jonathan, did you want to add some more thoughts?
Well, there's so much, Ben's stuff is so rich. Just to pick up on that last remark, I think, I think we might well see some kind of bubbling up um, of renewed interest in group experiences. Um, this lack of this dissatisfaction with elites that we see in the 1960s, which is part of the motivation for the reason people become searchers in sometimes called psychonauts using some of these drugs. I think this very well established, nearly certainly in the industrialized world anyway, rebellion against elites. We're seeing that now, the loss of faith of institutions, and there's another angle to this story, Ben, that you and I haven't talked about that really people have not written about yet. Maybe you'll do this. People who were interested in these drugs also in the 60s became very interested in group experiences. We think about psychedelics as individualized, right? Experience of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, one-on-one, and so forth. But the fact is that, Meade was an anthropologist, right? She was interested in groups and social networks, as my dad was. And what you see in the later 60s is the development of what were called encounter groups, sensitivity groups, what were called in the late 40s T groups, training groups by Kurt Lewin and his followers. And at the moment, some people on the call may be aware of this. At the moment, there are new groups being established under facilitators for psychedelics. The Baylor bioethics group has found that there are 298, according to them, organizations that offer for thousands of dollars retreats involving psychedelics in groups. And there are hundreds of these groups every year that all over the world. Now they're operating at the thin margins of ethics and of legality in our jurisdiction in the U.S. But there's a link here, and I can be very concrete about it, between mind expansion and a desire to have new kinds of contacts with other human beings. We're worried about, so since bowling alone in the early 90s, right, and isolation and social media, I think, and I haven't talked to Ben about this, but I'd be interested in your reaction, the reaction of others on the Zoom. I think there's the opportunity here for an emergence of what we saw with Est, for example, in the 1970s. People wanting to be back in touch with others, perhaps on drugs, perhaps not, We may be moving in a direction like that. And if I can add just one other concrete illustration of how this works out in intellectual history, as Ben well knows, Margaret Meade's biographer, her more formal biography, was a woman named Jane Howard. Jane Howard, and this is, I think, Ben, if I'm not mistaken, in the early 90s. She died in the early 90s, but before that, in the 80s, she published a rather scholarly book about Meade. Before that, her more famous book was a book called Please Touch, which was published in 1971 about the human potential movement. Uh, and she went to places like Esalen and had encounter group experiences, which I must say, by the way, as a young man, I had as well when I was 20, 21 years old. These were the same places. You could go from the hot tub at Esalen to a group, and then with somebody like Fritz Perls, the so-called Gestalt psychiatrist, and have drugs. uh, so, uh, so people like Cary Grant, right? If I'm not mistaken, Ben, Cary Grant's psychiatrist was Sidney Cohen, who starts out, as you mentioned, a big advocate of LSD, and then ends up rather critical and breaks from Leary. So I'll stop there. There's a lot of intellectual history here and a lot of cultural history that remains to be mined. And I think there is a through line from the late 40s, when the first study is done at the Boston Psychopathic Hospital, now Massachusetts Medical Center, to what's going on now with people who are interested in psychedelics, hasn't gotten formal approval yet, but still going back to psychedelics and going back into groups.
Good, thank you.
Just to respond to that, there's a really interesting letter that Margaret Meade responds to in 1969 that in 69 she comes out in favor of cannabis legalization. So she gets under a lot of social pressure, quite a lot of hate mail for being a druggie or for aligning with the hippies, because it's 1969. And she gets a letter saying, basically, you seem to be on Timothy Leary's side. Does that mean you also advocate for everyone to use acid? And she says, I basically summarizing something like, I was optimistic about it, but it became a tool of isolation. It was people sitting alone in a room. And I believe anything that's culturally important needs to be a group experience. And then interestingly, she says, I think in the future, they'll develop a drug like LSD, but safer, which will facilitate that. And it's kind of interesting how MDMA does kind of get framed, and it's still being framed as like the more group linking, I can't think of the word, but the more like dynamic and socially engaged variant of that. So
I just want to invite people to submit questions. If you want to ask your own question, please raise your hand and then you'll be able to speak through Zoom. And if you want us to read your questions to the group, please put them in the Q&A function. Okay, Ben, I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
I was going to say I could take the first one if that works.
That would be great.
And Jonathan, if you want to speak to it as well. It's the one about, should I just read out, or people can see the question?
No, so people who give talks about psychedelics rarely, if ever, mention whether they have experimented with psychedelics themselves and how their experiences have shaped their research interests and trajectories. So they're inviting you to share your experiences.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this. I think that, well, so first of all, yes, one of my main interests in writing the book is that I have had psychedelic experiences. And they were thought-provoking and mostly positive. I also have had the experience of a family member having very, very negative psychedelic experiences. So mine were quite positive, but I've been party and firsthand witness to very bad ones. And so I feel like that was sort of shaped my desire to write the book in the first place, which was, both, as you saw, I'm very enthusiastic and interested by the archival sources, but I'm also really intrigued by that tension that runs through the whole field of, I think a lot of people who have spent time with psychedelics in their lives have seen the good and the bad. And so I definitely think it's important to have firsthand experiences of both. The people I'm most skeptical of are the ones who just started tripping and now changed their life path to like study psychedelics in whatever domain that might be. I met some of them when I was researching this book. For instance, scientists who went to an ayahuasca ceremony and now they changed their career to be psychedelic therapists. That can be great, but I do think it's important to have had several years at least of living with that and seeing the various ways it plays out. I also think you can write about psychedelics with having never tried them. But I personally am more of like the William James experiential philosophy school. So I definitely, for myself, felt like I had to. And I did, before writing the book. I now have two young children, so I definitely am not in a position to do it now. But while researching the book, I did have a psychedelic experience again, just to kind of put myself in the mindset of the people I was writing about.
Well, I can speak to that a little bit as well. I'm much more shallow than Ben because my psychedelic experiences were really I guess, for party purposes in my early 20s. Once with mescaline, once with LSD. I can't say it either changed my life, but um, I should add that I did have a prior psychedelic experience, you might say, or a psychedelic adjacent experience when I was 10 years old, which always shocks my students when I put it that way. Um, but when I was 10, a group of people who were in group therapy in New York City came to Beacon, New York, where I grew up, and my father's mental hospital was 20 acres, and um, they came in a school bus, and I learned years later that they had been there in 1962 for an LSD therapy weekend with their psychiatrist from New York City, from Manhattan. I learned that years later from my mother. I was really curious about the school bus. And then in 1967, and Ben knows this, um, Stan Grof, who was one of the early psychedelic researchers in Prague, visited my father as soon as he got off the plane from Prague. And there's a picture of me with Stan and my parents. And so I had these prior sort of brushes with psychedelics as a young person. When I had my own experiences, I can't say that they changed my life. Although they were the LSD experience was quite entertaining.
Well, since you mentioned Graf, there's a question from Santiago Caderian, who's a sociologist from Argentina, asking about the connections between people like Reich, Graf, or Timothy Leary, and asking about the popularity of the publications that were produced by this circle.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's a link with Timothy Leary. He's a major figure in the second half of the book because he, to my mind, tries to kind of as he's trying to form a professional identity as a psychedelic scientist, which is actually the second act of his life. He's doing this in his 40s. Um, he's directly contacting Margaret Meade. He literally writes her a letter saying, "Will you come to Boston and do psilocybin with me? I think you'll find it interesting." And it's kind of obsequious. He's like kind of, a supplicant. And he also befriends that guy, Ralph Abrams, who is mentioned on the first page of our LSD memo. Ralph Abrams stayed at Harvard. He was a Harvard student. Actually, in the 1949 Boston Psychopathic Hospital experiment that Jonathan mentioned, he was one of the Harvard students used as a control subject. Um, and he becomes a major proponent of LSD and is actually a member of Leary's psilocybin research project. He's actually like one of the few people, I think, literally given the keys to the medicine cabinet who can unlock it and take out psilocybin and give it to people. I think it's like literally Leary, Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, um, and this guy, Ralph Abrams, for a period of time who have that access. And Ralph Abrams remains Meade's like friend and confidant throughout that period. So there's these letters between them where he's kind of reporting on what's going on with Leary. So definitely there's a direct link. Um, and then there's a whole Esalen chapter to the story where it's later in this mid to late 60s, Gregory Bateson becomes sort of like a reluctant, Yoda-like figure at Esalen, who's sort of like everyone's, sort of idol in a way. And there he exerts quite a strong influence on what you might call like the Stan Grof West Coast late 60s, 70s wing of it. There's a lot more to say, but that's what jumps to mind.
The other funny thing about Leary, going back to the connection, Ben, between psychedelics and group experiences, as you know, Timothy Leary started out as an expert on group therapy. He got his PhD. He studied personalities in groups. There is this thing he designed called Leary circles.
Mhm.
But then he ends up, as this research assistant professor at Harvard in 1960 and so forth. And he meets Alpert, later Bob Ramdas, and he gets into the LSD stuff. So he himself had a kind of a funny link to group experiences, and I guess you could say that his commune in Millbrook, after he left, was kind of a group experience for a few years until it became completely untenable with law enforcement. So um, there are these interesting links as well. On the science side, you mentioned Henry Beecher in your in your remarks, and of course Beecher, first chaired anesthesiology professor at Harvard, a major figure in the history of bioethics with a paper in 1966 in which he uh, said that there were a couple of dozen unethical experiments in the public medical literature. Um, but in between, Beecher in the early 50s did several LSD studies, at least one, the first of which probably was sponsored by the Army Chemical Corps. And Beecher was always floating also on the edges of these circles, and you had the image of Beecher. So another very interesting character who thought that you could use these drugs to understand the way the brain works, quite literally the brain, as an anesthesiologist. Also, it may be worth pointing out that at first it wasn't so much about treating people with emotional problems with LSD or other psychedelics as it was using LSD as what they called a psychotomimetic, which hasn't
Mm.
been mentioned yet. You
Yeah.
could study the psychotic experience by giving some normal, quote, normal person LSD.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that fell out
Exactly.
of favor fairly early, but it was quite important as a beachhead for justifying the science in the early 50s.
What's interesting is that it operated in parallel. And I even, a couple people I emailed who are original participants in the field still saw psychedelics as psychotomimetics,
Yeah,
meaning psychosis mimicking drugs. There were
yeah,
at least one person who used the word still in the year 2021 when I emailed with him,
yeah.
still saw it in those terms. And that was the prevalent way of seeing LSD in particular through the 50s, I would say, but it was kind of operating in this weird uh, double space where there was on published writing framing it psychedelics as psychotomimetics, but then
Yeah.
personally the people writing that were actually taking them and using them in all kinds of other mostly positive ways.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. And we should say also a somewhat global phenomenon. Graf in Prague. There were people in Bulgaria we know very little about, but they were definitely
yeah.
working. The Brits, right, were very interested in psychedelics and published papers about
Also Argentina, actually, there's a
Argentina
really
as well.
really
That's right.
interesting. I'm just throwing this out there if anyone is a graduate student or looking for a book project to write, specifically in Argentina, but all through South America and Latin America, because Mexico City is really important as a psychedelic research hub in the 50s. Definitely a book could be written about the Latin American psychedelic science movement because there was,
Barcelona as well. I had a medical student going into psychiatry who did some work on psychedelics in Spain in the 60s. Yeah.
to my mind, the most interesting. I really want to read a book about the Iron Curtain story. Prague, Budapest,
Yeah.
probably Moscow and St. Petersburg. I don't personally know, but definitely Prague and Budapest are really important.
My
Because
guess is that it was not so much the Soviet Union itself,
yeah,
but
but we don't know. I mean, that's the
hard
thing.
to you
Without
can't
going
prove a
into the
negative,
archives.
right? So we'd have
Yeah.
to find the archives. Um,
We have a
but
question about periodization. Um, One person asked about the growing enthusiasm from the 17th century to the 20th century, and was it caused by commodification of psychedelics for weapons or medicine, or was it a culmination of social events? So I guess one question is that true? Is it a growth of enthusiasm? Should we always think of it as from the 17th to the 20th, first century, a mix of hope and fear, or can you put a trajectory on it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm I'm wary of being too simplistic because it's kind of hard to if you picture this of any commodity or anything, it's kind of hard to make that big of a claim, which I admit to having sort of done in my talk, partly because it's in a weird way easier to do with psychedelics because the historical record, the written paper trail about psychedelics is so scarce before the 20th century that we really do only have, a few dozen references that I have been able to find. Whereas if you're trying to do that about like alcohol, let's say, or other really, really culturally dominant things, it's just too complicated to make a sweeping statement about, you know, changes over a period of centuries. In the case of psychedelics, I do think that one of the key things that happens is overwhelmingly um, written sources, not just by Europeans, but also by what in the 17th and 18th centuries would have been called like mestizo writers, people who are of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, who know non-European languages like Nawa or Quechua, in places where psychedelics have traditionally been used. Uh, they frame it in Christian terms. There's a very, very strong religious paradigm at work in how psychedelics are thought of. And so they speak to the devil is almost always something you see in these pre-20th century references. And really, strikingly, right up through the 30s. Like, so I was researching Margaret Meade's peyote research in 1930, which was one thing that surprised me about her biography. It's mentioned in Jane Howard's book that Jonathan mentioned. It's a good biography. She covers it for like a page. But Margaret Meade like, wrote a book about that research and mentions peyote extensively in it. So I was like digging into that episode. And Franz Boas, her mentor, the famous anthropologist, actually testified before Congress in favor of peyote remaining legal as a religious sacrament. And amidst that, there was tons of newspaper articles using terms like demonic and satanic to describe that practice. And so it was still really prevalent to frame things in Christian terms all through the 20th century, I would say, and kind of still is. I mean, it kind of dropped out recently, but it's a pretty recent shift historically. To my mind, that if I'm going to draw a really big picture story of, enthusiasm towards psychedelics or the reception history of them, it would be like secularization would be the single word I would use. Um, or perhaps a shift away from a Christian framework to a sort of postmodern, new age pastiche of different spiritual traditions might be a better way of thinking about it. Um, I wanted really briefly, there's the trip report as a medical record question.
Mhm.
Um, I think it's worth mentioning. I don't know how many people here are actively doing historical research on the topic, but it's like kind of this might be the right place to talk about it because it was one of those things that I thought about a lot and actually hit several roadblocks on is this HIPAA question of like what is admissible into the historical record? What are you allowed to see in an archive, and what is decided to be a medical record, which is confidential? And Jonathan, you're like, this is something very much in your wheelhouse, so I'm curious what you think. I had a couple of interesting conversations with archivists about where they draw these lines. The Cary Grant one very clearly is not HIPAA because he was a participant in an experiment where he wasn't a patient. And so he was just signing, they had the paperwork of him just signing off on this to be a test subject, which is a different thing than being a therapy patient. And in my experience with archives, the experiments were public. I was able to access those records. Um, the therapy records were not. And so, for instance, Sidney Cohen has tons, like literally several dozen boxes in my recollection at UCLA Special Collections, which are not readable by researchers until like the 2030s because of there's a kind of like time frame when those confidentiality laws expire. And I actually remember thinking when I was encountering that in the archive that this is going to change the history of psychedelics when those become available, because everything now is really strongly being shaped by what's available. So my story is about psychedelic science, partly because the scientific records are what is there for researchers to find. When the patient records become available, it's going to be a whole different set of voices, different stories, and they're currently just kind of under lock and key for good reasons. I mean, if the people are alive, they should not be accessible. But in 200 years, should they be? In 20 years, you know, that's going to change the field a lot, I think.
I mean, the HIPAA question is really a legal question, and it has to do with whether you're a covered entity or not. I'm not a lawyer, but this is what the lawyers tell me. So, um, presumably, the institutions that have these documents are covered entities under HIPAA. Um, I have not worked in the archives that Ben has worked in, but I do work in the archives now and then at the Countway, which is Harvard, and they have an 80-year rule. So if I want to look at my father's patient records, I can't look at them past, in my father's case, 1944. Um, so I think that it's really the archives uh, trump the question of HIPAA. It's the archival rules about access to potentially sensitive records.
We have a question about comparing uses of peyote to LSD. And as you mentioned, people were studying peyote in the 50s and 60s, as repeated in the question. However, it shifted to LSD. And the question is, did colonial attitudes persist in how peyote was studied and used? And could that association have been a factor in the shift from peyote studies to LSD studies?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think so. I definitely think that there is something kind of distinctive about, I would actually make the claim that there's three major substances that are sometimes called psychedelic. I don't know if I would even define them all in the same category, but LSD, MDMA, and ketamine have a distinctively different historical trajectory, I would argue, because they are entirely products of laboratories. There was no, archaeological records of ketamine use 6,000 years ago, which there is for peyote. And likewise, obviously, that it follows from that there is no non-Western societies using MDMA and ketamine. They were just sort of these de novo products of the 20th century, in the same way that the nuclear bomb was a product of the 20th century. They're just like very distinctly outputs of an industrial 20th century society, which let them kind of actually accrue a lot of negative associations, which didn't for the others, because they're sort of Dr. Strangelovey sort of cultural objects, which are associated with creepy people in lab coats. It's not as easy to portray them as having this safety profile, which is sort of built into the claims that something has been used for thousands of years. If someone's giving you a cup of coffee, you can say there's, ancient traditions of coffee use, although coffee is actually pretty new. It's 1,000 years old, but still, you're not going to get freaked out by that because you know that millions of humans have used it before. Whereas, there, Alexander Shulgin, this famous Berkeley psychonaut and chemist, made literally hundreds of different derivatives of MDMA and other compounds, which he was literally the first person, he and his wife were the first people ever in all of human history to consume them because he had just invented them in a lab. And I have to imagine that was kind of nerve-wracking and scary for the people involved. They're guinea pigs, right?
Yeah.
So there's that element, but there's also, I think what the question is getting at, and I think is right, a kind of colonial holdover of kind of a satanic panic sort of element that I mentioned before, that if a substance is new, it doesn't have this history of being associated with um, non-Western and non-Christian cultures of spirituality and medicine, which are, in many frames, especially in the 20th century, thought of as inferior or less than the Western medical framing. So in that sense, it was actually kind of a selling point of LSD that it didn't have any of this deeper history because it could be portrayed as a wonder drug, a product of Western medicine, and not as like a traditional herbal remedy or whatever you might want to. If you're trying to sell peyote on people, you would definitely talk about that history, and it would land differently in different audiences. Today, it sort of ties into people's desire to get away from Western medicine, but in the 30s and 40s, when everyone had just lived through, you know, the invention of penicillin, right, and Western medicine was being valorized, it had a very different. It kind of hit differently in a culture, and it made people a little bit. I think it's true that it made it less easy to sell as a wonder drug, specifically peyote. Psilocybin has its own history of being sort of, I would say, exoticized as like this mountain curandera story of Maria Sabina and shamans. What I find so striking about that is that number one, peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, unlike peyote, grow over a very wide like range of the world. They're not unique to one place. They're actually quite common globally, is my understanding. They're probably growing outside in the redwood forest where I'm speaking to you right now, for instance, some variant, something that contains psilocybin. Um, and they also, if you go back to the historical records, we're not really only being used in a shamanistic context in the early modern period. It's actually kind of a 20th century thing to frame these traditional cultures of psychedelics as only being used by shamans or only by wise women in the mountains or in the forest. I would say it's a great simplification, but that did become the cultural framing, and it definitely shaped like how popular they were able to be, because the people who were drawn to them were kind of Western tourists going to the mountains of Mexico and not someone in a pharmacy office.
The peyote also functioned to some degree for the early psychedelic researchers as a foothold. People could say, gee, indigenous groups are permitted to use peyote in their ceremonies. It's a mind-expanding drug. Why not give us permission to do what we do as well? It's and people didn't focus, as you said, on the lab coat problem, right? The manufacture of a new compound um, is a difference, but peyote at least gave people the sense, well, we can do our own version of this with something new, something else. Um, there's a question, I think, Babak, about the Eleusinian mysteries, which are quite fascinating, and whether some ancient Greeks had similar kinds of trippy experiences with some version of the acid diethylamide, but we don't really know much about what they were actually using. We know that those events happened. Plato mentions mentions the experience that people have, but they seem to have ingested something, uh, the kukion, which I wonder if somehow that isn't doesn't give us kooky. I'm not sure what the linguist would say about that, but they definitely had a drink of some kind, and it seems to have had something like ergot or fungus as part of the experience. Um, it, so this goes back to actually Ben's remark about the redwoods and the mushrooms in Redwood, California. This stuff is an ordinary part of human experience. People have always eaten stuff, and people have always wanted to change their consciousness. Well, my daughter reminded me, she's a therapist now, and she's 34 years old. She reminded me a couple of years ago that when she was 12, she was in our car driving her home or something from some event, and she said, maybe she was 11 or 12, and she said, the girls in my class are starting to talk about drugs. I'm not going to do that. And I said, yes, you will. And when she told me that, I said, oh my God, that was a really bad parenting move, right? So, no, that was good. That was honest. Because, of course, people are always eating stuff and changing their consciousness.
Well, maybe in parallel to the indigenous or colonial populations, there's a question about how reliably we can map the hopes or fears associated with these drugs to the people who are using them, whether they're dominant and affluent groups in a particular society, whether it's the 17th century or Silicon Valley, or whether it's marginalized groups who have access to these drugs. Is that a reliable map historically?
Mm. That's an interesting question too. I think so. I was talking about how there's, I think, a kind of simplification, and I would say an exoticization element in play of like only framing non-Western or pre-modern cultures of psychedelics as like a shaman that you have to journey to reach. And the reason I said that above all is that when we look at archaeological evidence, which is quite strong here in terms of like demonstrating this, uh, psychedelics are actually associated with urban elites in the pre-modern Americas. So they're like not being used by a sort of fringe herbalist curandera woman. They are, but they're also being used by the person who's like the leader of a city state, in public, in
Yeah.
front of everyone. They're a form of performance of authority, actually,
Yeah.
not this countercultural, proto-countercultural thing in many cases. And I think a lot of that counterculture shamanistic framing is us reading backwards the 70s and 80s and 90s stories of psychedelics back into very different past cultures. And it's also the Margaret Meade kind of thing of like a lot of those cultural survivals are totally shaped by the transformations of the 20th century. So we have to be very careful in not reading backward stuff happening even in the 40s and 50s and assuming that's true of the 1650s or earlier. And so one of the things we see is that a lot of elites in Mesoamerica, but also in the areas where San Pedro cactus grows in South America, San Pedro contains mescaline, um, we're actually using these substances in a performative public context as a seemingly as an assertion of difference. I am the leader. I'm able to take this substance. It's almost like Dune, it's like the spice. It's like this very elitist, cherished, powerful drug, which is not widely distributed. Um, and it definitely gets tied up to questions of like, who are the self-appointed elites in a society? Um, to a weird extent, I actually feel like Timothy Leary's circle was continuing that, even though they were framing it as this mass movement. Um, one of the things that came up in like Jane Houston, who's this kind of interesting person I interviewed for my book, um, she's later became like a sort of pretty well-known, quite well-known author on New Age subjects, but she was there at the beginning. She was like a member of the Timothy Leary circle, sort of. He mentions her in his memoirs as like stalking through their house and talking to them when they were beginning work, him and Ramdas. But she said something like middle-aged men um, staring at their navels in little rooms in Cambridge, Massachusetts are not going to lead a broad-based social movement. That's rough paraphrase. And that's jumped out at me as like, exactly. Like, it was so cool to me that that was basically my feeling too. And it was interesting to see that at the very beginning of that, someone pointed that out and then they just kind of ignored it. But they were social elites, right? These are like Harvard professors who are like talking on the TV about, I mean, who could be on TV in 1960? It's a very limited
Right.
group of people. Um, so yeah, I think that's a really important question for kind of stripping away, I think, some of the BS around psychedelics, which is often framed as like we're all on the same page, it brings everyone together. It's often kind of an assertion of elite authority still, and it has been in the past too.
Yeah.
Jonathan, did you have any thoughts about this?
No, I think that's actually probably a very, good way to sort of bring closure to the conversation. In fact, what Ben is doing also is referring to his first book, which is just terrific, in which he explains how what should say the importation of compounds uh, from the so-called New World to the Old World was wrapped up with the creation of modern pharmacology, and who's the expert. So there's a whole story here about the sociology of expertise and authority that's tied up with who gets to use this stuff. Uh, and as you said, for what the first thing people say about Timothy Leary is, well, he was a Harvard professor, so that must mean something.
Can I just
Good.
say, number one, I would just want to say thank you, but also people who we didn't have a chance to address the questions. That's my email address right there, bebreen@ucsc.edu. So I'd be happy to talk by email. So please get in touch. Also, if you're a graduate student, please be in touch. I have plenty of um, archival photos and other things I can share.
Great. There were some questions about methodology and about research we didn't get to, but obviously to be continued. Thank you very much, Ben. Thank you, Jonathan. This has been terrific. Thanks to everyone who attended and for your terrific questions. Thanks, everyone. Take care.